I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today I'm speaking with Nikole Hannah-Jones, the executive producer and the creator of the 1619 Project, a documentary on Hulu, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel. First thing I wanted to ask you is, there was so much publicity about the 1619 Project when it first came into the public consciousness, as part of the New York Times. Was the idea for making the 1619 Project into a documentary series something that you had you had always planned for this, or did that come about later?
Yeah, that definitely came about later. I'm a print reporter, I think, in terms of print. I write. I've never done documentary before. And so it was after the documentary, or excuse me, after the magazine published, as well as the podcast, that we were approached by TV studios to consider turning it into a documentary series.
The interesting thing about the 1619 Project is that I think some people may know the controversy better than the actual project itself. And you have this the reaction was so visceral to it. You addressed it in the documentary, but what I'm curious about is, what was the first thing that happened that made you realize that the right wing was going to come after you for this project?
I mean, I knew that there was going to be pushback against the project. That's why the project had to exist in the first place, is that we have not wanted to really grapple as a nation with how foundational slavery is to the country that developed, and how that legacy still shapes so much of our society. And of course, that's what the 1619 Project argues. So I knew there was going to be pushback. I didn't understand, of course, that it would go all the way to the President of the United States, to sitting senators, to Secretary of State, to bans all across the country. I think when I started to really understand that there was going to be this orchestrated campaign against the project would have been right around the time of the racial justice protests of 2020. The 1619 Project and the year 1619 and this idea of a 400-year struggle in America really became the lexicon of those protests that year, as we saw monuments being torn down and really questioning about our founding myths. And at the same time, then we really saw this orchestrated targeting of both myself as a journalist and the 1619 Project. And I think that's when I really, when I saw the first law, including a law in my home state of Iowa, seeking to ban the teaching of the 1619 Project from any public schools, is when I understood this was something different than I'd ever experienced before.
So one of the other things that I think is interesting about this is you have so many you have this thing with the magazine and the podcast, but then you develop this. Was there anyone you interviewed whose story you found interesting, but for one reason or another, you just couldn't include in the final product?
I mean, of course, we interviewed a lot of different people, because with this documentary, we were actually, reporting. So it wasn't just going and re-interviewing people we had met before, or telling stories that had already been told before. We were going out and doing original reporting on contemporary American society as we were creating the documentary. So there are lots of people, when you're a journalist, you interview people, or you start going down a certain path for a story, and ultimately it either doesn't work out, it doesn't fit into the structure, you have too much content. But I guess the person that or the group I thought about the most is we interviewed these two Black women that were part of this group called the Black Women's Blueprint. And it was for the race episode of the documentary series. And they had bought this land in upstate New York, and were really trying to create this really remarkable place of healing, particularly for Black women, around childbirth, maternal and infant mortality, and just being a Black woman in America. So we spent, quite a bit of time with them, but unfortunately weren't able to get them into the final cut.
It's also interesting how this how we've seen it, how we've seen this 1619 project play out in terms of the public circle and everything. And what I'm curious about is, what have been some of the biggest impacts that you've seen as a result of this whole experience, like in terms of like some of the impacts that it's had on some aspects of education or anything like that since its inception?
Yeah, I mean, the impact of the project has been just tremendous. It's exceeded every dream I could have possibly had. And I guess the greatest proof of that is the level of pushback that the project has received. I mean, the project has been mentioned in both of Donald Trump's impeachment trials. The project was, disparaged in the confirmation hearing for the first Black woman Supreme Court justice. So it really has become kind of this stand-in for a vision of America that conservatives don't want us to understand. But to me, when you look at, when I first pitched the project, my primary goal was I wanted Americans to know the date 1619. I wanted that date to be as familiar to us as the year 1776, and in forcing us to do that, I wanted us to grapple with what it means that slavery is one of the oldest institutions in the United States, that it predates on these lands the American Revolution by 150 years. I mean, that has been accomplished. People know that date. People are arguing about that date. As we're having these conversations about what should be taught in the classroom and what shouldn't be taught in the classroom, that's because we're being forced as a society to really stare our myths in the face and say, what haven't we been taught, and who gets to decide how we collectively remember our country, and how that we understand the way that past is shaping the reality that we live in today. That is something, it's 4 years later, and I still talk about the 1619 Project every day. You still see politicians, educators, activists talking about the project every day. So to me, I think that really demonstrates that impact. We know that date. And even, when Donald Trump was disparaging the 1619 Project, that also just meant that all of his followers also know the date 1619, whether they read a page of the book or not, whether they watch an episode of the documentary series or not, they also know that date and have to grapple with the Black American role in American history.
We live in such a weird political time right now. And that's to put it mildly, I guess. We've had all these things happen, and there's been a lot of reasons that I feel that people should be pessimistic. The fall of Roe, the Supreme Court, the way that state legislators are operating. We just see with Alabama, just saying when the Supreme Court says you need to create a second majority Black district, they're like, nah. It's hard to be I share the sentiment that it's hard to be optimistic right now. Do you think that people should believe that people who believe in equality should be optimistic right now? And if so, what's the biggest reason, if any, that people should feel optimistic about equality in our nation's future?
Yeah, optimism is not something that I feel right now. And I think it's very hard to tell people that this is a time for optimism. We have a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court that is going to be creating legislation, but creating law that's going to impact for generations. We have an extremely divided electorate. We have a former president who just turned himself in for not wanting to accept the will of voters in this society. We have book bans happening all over, targeting of LGBTQ kids, and it's not a time of optimism. But this is what I'll say. I think the power of the 1619 Project is that it shows us that the reality that we all live in has been architected, that it is not inevitable, that this is not the society that we have to have, that this society was created. And if we know that, then we know we have the power to create something else. We know that Dr. King always said the arc of the universe, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, I don't think it bends on its own if it bends. if it bends, it's because we choose to bend it. It's because we choose to decide as a society that we want to be more just and that we believe in equality and that we'll take the steps to bring that about. So while I don't have optimism, I also don't feel like we are powerless in our society, and that we should know that whatever our future is going to be in America and in the world, it's the future that we choose, and that ultimately the choice is ours. And I find that to be empowering.
Well, Nikole, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Thank you.